Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Kuf Chavav. We're going to get started from the top of our daf with Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav Asi. We're going to read this sugya according to the Rashbam, who basically connects this sugya with the previous sugya that we've been learning about the shevach and the investment that the orphans make. If you remember, the assumption is that if the orphans make an investment, for sure nobody thinks that the Bechor gets Pishnayim of the enhancements to the property. Remember, there was only an argument about what if it happened on its own, or what if it was a loan, and we had a whole issue of that. But everyone agreed that if after the father dies and the orphans decide before they distribute the property they're going to invest in the property, the Bechor doesn't get Pishnayim, a double portion of the investment, okay, of the enhancement. They'll get the original, right? Let's say it was worth 100, so they'll get the Pishnayim of the 100, but any kind of added value that the orphans invested will not go to the Bechor. So according to the Rashbam, that's how we're going to learn the sugya. After explaining Rabbeinu Chananel in the Hebrew Shiur, I decided it just took too long and it was complicated. I decided I'm going to leave Rabbeinu Chananel aside. If you have the current, they have good footnotes where it describes Rabbeinu Chananel has an entirely different way of reading it, which actually connects it to this next sugya we're going to learn later on in the daf. And so you can see what's interesting about it is sometimes the problem is that Rav Asi basically is going to say 3 words here, and the Gemara doesn't give you enough information. And the question is, how do we, it's either connected to the previous section or it's connected to the upcoming section. So there's 2 totally different ways to learn the sugya. But for simplicity purposes, I'm going to stick with the Rashbam. Okay, I put in the summary Rabbeinu Chananel's interpretation also, so you can get a little bit of an inkling of it. But we're going to go to keep things more clear cut. We're going to go with the Rashbam, but know that there's a totally different way of reading this sugya. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav Asi. So Rav Huna says in the name of Rav Asi, Bechor shemicha micha. If a Bechor protests, his protest is valid. Okay, what is he protesting? So if we go with Rashbam, who basically says we're talking about the previous sugya, which is the orphans, if they invest before they distribute the property, and the investment we just said doesn't go, the enhancements don't go to the Bechor. So it's often in the Bechor's best interest to say, let's distribute the property before we invest, because I want to gain the benefits on my double portion. I want to invest my property, right? Invest in my property and make all the proceeds. I don't want you to do it because if we do it before we distribute it, I'll lose out on the enhancements of that double portion, right? Let's assume there's 3 brothers, which means the property is divided into 4, which means, right, and the Bechor gets 2 of those parts. Each of the other brothers gets each a part. So the Bechor would rather get the investment on that extra quarter that's his Pishnayim but put the work in himself so that he can get the enhancements on that and not have all the brothers together invest, and then he's going to lose out on the enhancements of the double portion, right? The enhancements on that double portion will be split in 3 between the 3 brothers. So now, what does it mean if he protests? His protest is valid. It means if he says, I don't want you to invest in this property right now. I'd rather get it first. Give it to me and I'll do the investing myself. And they don't listen to him. And they say, we're going to invest it anyway. So his protest is valid. Okay, what does this mean? It means that he will basically get the double portion of the enhancements as well. So even though we said it's clear according to everybody, he doesn't get the enhancements. But if he protested and said, I don't want you to invest, and they just said, we don't care, we're going to do it anyway, and they ignore him, then he gets the double portion, the enhancements on the double portion. That's what this statement is saying, according to, again, like I said, this is the Rashbam's interpretation. It's not everybody's. I'm a Rabba. But now comes Raba and qualifies this and says, wait. Now, what this is really based on, and this we're going to see later on, is that there's a bit of a debate about this, but the double portion is considered as if, okay, there's something a little different about the double portion and the regular portion. When the father dies, the question is, right, this is all considered the estate of the father. And until it's divided up, it's not owned by anybody because they haven't divided it. Now, there's a bit of a debate even between the Rashbam and Tosfot about this. I don't want to get into too many different details here to get you off track of the simple reading of the daf, but we'll go with the Rashbam, who basically says that until it's divided between the brothers, nobody owns it. It's jointly owned, but nobody really owns any part of it. Okay, The only way to say someone does own a part, if you remember, laws of Breira. We talked about this machloket, or they like Yorshim, or they like Lekuchot. I'm not going to get into all that. But according to the Rashbam thinks that nobody owns the property right now. It's not, right? Nobody owns any part of it singly. They own it jointly. However, the Pishnayim part has a different nature to it. And why is that? Because the Torah says by Pishnayim, and maybe I didn't say this explicitly, but it's kind of implicit, but I want to say it clear in a very clear-cut manner. The whole way we learn about Bechor is in a very strange way. The Pishnayim of the Bechor, in the Torah, it comes up in this backwards kind of manner, wherein we saw these psukim already, but I didn't really say it explicitly, and I want to make it very clear. It says in this psukim, in Dvarim Kafal, if you Tetzayin, Yud Zayin, it basically says if you have a person who has a wife he loves and a wife he doesn't love, and there's a Bechor, right? The beloved and the hated, it's a little bit of a strange language. It a little bit references, or maybe a lot references the Rachel and Leah, because also there the Bechor, as we talked about, got all mixed up. And he decides that he wants to give the Pishnayim to the one who's not the Bechor, but who's the Bechor, the firstborn to the wife he loves, who's younger. He's not allowed to do that. That's how Pishnayim comes up in the Torah. It doesn't come up as you have to give Pishnayim, but it basically says you cannot give Pishnayim to the one who's not the Bechor, because the Pishnayim goes to the Bechor. And from there, right, you learn the laws of the Bechor. But the words there say latet lo Pishnayim. And we already learned what is latet. It means it's a gift. Right? Now, if something is a gift, that means that as soon as the father dies, as opposed to inheritance has to be divided between the brothers. So the part that's inheritance, which is, the one portion for the Bechor and the other two portions, let's say for the other two brothers in the example we gave, those aren't in their possession really until it's divided, because it's all joint before that. But the Bechor's double portion is a gift, which means that the minute the father dies, it's already as if it's in the Bechor's property. So therefore, that's why the Bechor has the rights to protest, because he's protesting something they're doing with his land. And they're, in effect, thieves right now, because they stole something that wasn't theirs. Now, the portion that was his jointly with them, that's not stealing. But the portion of the Pishnayim already is if it's given to him. And this, we're going to see there's a machloket later on about this. But right now, we're going to understand it like this. And that's why he has the rights to be mochen. He can protest. So let's read what Rabba says now. Rabba says, now once we put it into laws of thieves, we're going to very much understand Rabba's distinction. Rabba says, Mistaber tame de Ravasi ba'anavimu b'tsarum zeitimu misakum. When we say that the Bechor can protest, and if they take it, he gets all the enhancements on it, even though theoretically he shouldn't get the enhancements on the Pishnayim, but he does, because because he shouldn't get the enhancements at all, but he shouldn't get a double. Sorry, didn't say that clearly. He shouldn't get a double portion of the enhancements, because he doesn't get double portion on the enhancements. But he does here because he said, don't do this, and they took it anyway. So what are the enhancements? If there were grapes that were attached to the vine, and then they picked them. Zeitimu misakum, there were olives on the tree, and they picked them, right? They're obviously worth more once they're off the tree, because you don't have to hire someone to pick them. So they're higher value, he gets the enhancements. Aval derachum lo, but not if they turn them into wine or turn the olives into oil. Why is that? Let's go back to our laws of Ganavim. This will be a good review of Baba Kama, things we learned then. If somebody steals from you and they change the item, remember we learned shinoi shame, if it changes name, if it changes form, what happens? The gazlan, the thief, basically gains ownership rights to it, which is a little strange, but what does it mean? It means that at this point, what do they have to return? They don't have to return the enhanced item. They have to return the item as it was valued at the time of the theft. Now, these brothers, in essence, stole the double portion, invested it. If it goes up in value, they have to give him the enhancements because they stole his item. But that's only if it's still called the same thing. It still looks like the same thing. Once they change it and they turn it into wine and oil, they acquired it. And when they acquire it, they have to return it at the value at the time it was stolen. So they don't have to give him any enhancements. Okay, that's what Rabbah comes and explains. And that's based on basic laws of theft. Again, this is all the Rashbam's understanding. Again, just know that Rabbeinu Hananel doesn't understand the sugya at all having to do with this. Rav Yosef Amar, afilu drachum. Rav Yosef says, no, even if they turned it into wine or oil. To which the Gemara says, how could you possibly say that? Drachum meikar inve hashtachamra. How could you say that? It was originally grapes, now it's wine. It's something totally different. And therefore, again, a thief who changes an item doesn't have to return the invested item. They have to return it at the value it was at the time of the theft. To which they answer, Kida'amar Rav Ukva Rachama, just like Rav Ukva Rachama answered this exact same question somewhere else and explained, Litain lo demei hazek anavav. I'm going to explain that in a minute, but I just want to finish the sentence. We're going to do copy paste. Rav Ukva Rachama was asked a very similar question, or maybe even the exact same question, on the same thing. And he answered the following thing. Hachanami notelo demei hazek anavav. We're going to basically copy and paste his answer into our sugya and explain Rav Yosef in the same manner that Rav Ukva explained himself. Okay, so what is this Diliteno Demei Hazek Anavav? And then in a minute we'll see on what did Rav Ukva answer that. What it means is, no, what does it mean you have to pay at the time of the theft if you're a thief? It means if you change the item and you invested it or you changed it and it turned into something else, like grapes turned into wine, you have to pay from the moment of the theft. So that means if it went up in value, you only pay from the moment of the theft. If it went down in value, well, you don't pay what it's worth now. You have to compensate for the loss because you have to pay what it was valued at the time of the theft. So basically what they're going to explain now, as Rav Ukva explained somewhere else, that when Rav Yosef said, even when they turned it into wine, they still have to compensate the brother, the Pishnayim part. What they mean is if it decreased in value. And that fits perfectly with the whole theory about if it was stolen, you have to pay b'shad gzela, because what Rabbi Yosef isn't disagreeing with Rabba, even though it sounds like they were disagreeing. Rabba said drachum lo, and he said even drachum. What it means is that if what he's talking about is a different situation than Rabba. Rabba was talking about the sheva, about the enhancements. Rabba said, if it went up in value, they don't have to give him what it went up in value if it changed, because that's based on laws of thieves. And comes Rav Yosef and says, yes, but if it went down in value, then they would have to compensate him for the loss. Now, again, think about it. If brothers invested together the estate of their father before they divided it up, all the loss would be equal on all of them. But if this firstborn complained and said, I don't want you investing it, they invested it anyway and lost money. So on his portion, he gets just like the rest of them. Too bad. Because again, it wasn't owned by him for him to protest, really. But on the double portion, he can protest. And what Rav Yosef says is, even if it went down in value, if it went down in value because they picked the grapes and the grapes spoiled before, right, and they didn't turn it into wine, well, the loss would be on him because they're not thieves that acquire the item yet. But if they turned it into wine, they would have to compensate him. And let's say they turned it into wine and the wine spilled. Okay, so there's grapes that were worth X amount are now worth nothing because they turned the wine spilled onto the ground and is not salvageable. So they would have to compensate him in that case. And then it's the same theory as Rabbah. It's just a totally different situation that he's talking about. And that's how they resolve the question. To which the Gemara just asked the final question, which is, sorry, I lost my place. Hecha itmar de Rav Ukva Rachama. Where did Rav Ukva Rachama say this answer? Because remember, we copied and pasted his answer. We took his answer there and then added it to here. Ahada Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Bechor upashut shiniach lehen avihen anavim ubitzarum zeitim umisakum Bechor notel pishnayim. So Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, a Bechor and a pashut, that their father left them grapes and they picked them, olives and they picked them. Bechor notel pishnayim. Now the Rashbam adds here that it's the exact same case. He adds the words and the Bechor was mocheh, and he said, I don't want you doing that. Okay. Could be you could explain it otherwise, but he says specifically it's the exact same case. The Bechor gets pishnayim, right? He gets pishnayim of those anavim. Afilu drachum, and even if they turn them into wine, to which the they asked Rav Ukma, which is going to be the same thing they asked Rav Yosef, because again, we said, oh, he had the same problem, answered it that way. We'll take his answer and use it for Rav Yosef. How could he get the pishnayim of the wine? They stole it, went against his wishes, right? They turned it into something else. Theoretically, right? They shouldn't be able to. He shouldn't. Sorry. Right? They should gain the shevach. So now what it means is, in that case, he doesn't get the shevach, right? He definitely doesn't get the shevach because I hope I didn't say the reverse a second ago, but he doesn't get the shevach because they own it and they only have to return it from the moment of the theft. However, what I was talking about, says Rav Ukma, is that if it went down in value, they would have to compensate him because that fits perfectly. Mishalem kishat haksela. Okay, so that's our sugya so far. Going with the Rashbam, it really connects with the previous sugya about the sheva sheshbichu, right? That in the investment, remember, a bechor doesn't get pishnayim unless the basic point of this is unless he protests. If he doesn't want them to invest it and he wants to get his pishnayim so he can invest it himself, and they go ahead anyway and invest it, he gets the pishnayim of the investment. But not if it went up, if not if they turned it into something else, because then they become owners of it. They're thieves who end up owning it, who have to return it only from the moment of theft, which means for better and for worse. If it went up, they have to return it from the moment of theft and they get to keep the enhancements. But if it went down in value, they have to compensate him. That's this section so far. Okay, Amar Rav Asi. Sorry, there was something that was going on in the chat that I wasn't following. Interesting, the daf isn't coming up. I wonder why. Let me just fix that. I see why. Okay, there's a mistake here. I'm going to fix it. Okay, give me 1 second. See, the date was wrong. So right now, and it will go up. Okay, but going back now to our topic. Okay, Amar Rav Asi. Bechor shenatal chelek kipashut viter. Okay, so according to the Rashbam, we're now starting a new sugya. Okay, a new section on some other issue, which a little bit connects, but is a bit of a new section. This is why, again, I'm not going to go into Rabbeinu Hanano, but if you want to read up about it, like I said in the current footnotes, there's a good explanation of the Rabbeinu Hanano's approach that the previous sugya actually relates directly to this and not to the Sheva. Rav Asi says, a bechor, and you'll see why this connects in a minute, even according to the Rashbam. Bechor shenatal chelek kipashut viter. If a bechor takes a portion like a pashut, meaning, okay, let's say the father has 10 fields, okay, or fields and fruits and whatever it might be. Let's just say 10 fields for sake of taking a simple example. And they start dividing up one of the fields. Now, already I told you before that there's this distinction, and we'll see not necessarily everyone agrees with this, about the part that the Bechor gets like all his brothers and the portion that's the Pishnai. That's what we said until now. Now we're going to see there's a bit of a deliberation about this. What is really owned by the Bechor from the moment the father dies? Okay? And now we're going to say the following. If when dividing up, now once you divide it, of course, it all belongs to each of the brothers, right? They all each become owners of their part. So let's say we divide one field and not the rest. And the Bechor in that one field says, you know what? I don't want to get Pishnayim. Now, why would he say I don't want the double portion? Remember, we learned that if there's an obligation, right? And basically the Bechor has to pay, if the father owes money to someone, the Bechor has to pay double. So it's sometimes in the Bechor's best interest, if you remember, the Bechor can choose, because it was a gift, remember we learned that? Because it's a gift, the Bechor can say, thank you for the gift, I don't want it. I don't want it, not for the gift and not for its obligations that come with it, right? Because gifts often come with expenses, right? Let's say he just doesn't want responsibility for a field. So he doesn't have it within his ability to deal with another field. It's too much. So for all sorts of reasons, the Bechor could say, I don't want it. Now the assumption is, and this is a working assumption of the sugi, even though we're going to have a machloket within this, the assumption is that if the Bechor says, I don't want Pishnayim of this field, we're assuming, unless he said otherwise, that he doesn't want Pishnayim of any of the property. Okay, and maybe this goes back to the loan issue because maybe he's just trying to get out of any obligations of the father's estate of paying double. So if when dividing 1 out of the 10 fields, or it could be 1 out of 2, or 1 out of 4, or it doesn't matter, but only part was divided, the rest wasn't divided, he takes a chelek kepashut, viter. Okay, when he said, I don't want pishnayim, he gave up on his pishnayim. Now, question is, my viter. On what did he mivater? The pishnayim of this field, like if he comes 10 minutes later and says, oh, I want double portion, it's too late? Or do we mean the pishnayim of the other 9 fields that weren't yet divided? So we're now going to have a big machloket, and the machloket is, what did Rava hold? Okay, it's a machloket between Rav Papa and Rav Papi. Okay, they sound very similar to their names. They're 2 different rabbis. They were each students of Rav, and they each have a different opinion about what Rav said. And soon we're going to see the story that led them to this lack of clarity about what Rava said. Because we're going to see it wasn't just that they said Rava said this, but it was all based on a story that happened, a situation that happened, and Rava said the following, and then he said something, and each one interpreted it differently. So Rav Papa Mishmei de Rava Amal, Viter Ba'ota Sadeh. Rav Papa said in the name of Rava that Rava held that it's only in that field he gave up his rights, but not for all the other fields. If he wants to get Pishnayim in all the other fields, he can. And in a minute, we'll see why he says that. Rav Papi Mishmei de Rava Amar Viter B'chol Nechasim Kula. Okay, you could assume that was going to be the debate, right? Rav Papi said, no. He said, I don't want Pishnayim here. That is valid for everything. So now let's see what the basis of their machloket is. Rav Papa Mishmei de Rava Amar Viter Ba'ota Sadeh. Hasaval ein lo lebachor kodem chaluka. He says the reason why he's mevater only in that one field is because, contrary to what I said earlier, which is the bechor gets the pishnayim the moment the father dies because it's a gift, Rav Papa didn't think that that was the case. Rav Papa said the bechor doesn't get the pishnayim, nothing, not the regular part, not the pishnayim, until it's distributed. Basically, until the land is distributed, or the property, whatever it is, it could be movables. Until they're distributed, it belongs to the estate of the father. The bechor is not considered an owner. He's a joint owner, but joint owners can't do all sorts of things with things they own jointly because they're not the only owner. They're not the sole owner. So now let's go back to our working assumption. We assume there's this one field. We know that. That's a fact. The bechor says, I don't want pishnayim in this field. The assumption was that unless he said, but I want pishnayim in the rest of the property, the assumption was that he meant I don't want pishnayim at all, in anything. However, the problem is that he doesn't own the rights yet to the pishnayim in order to say, I don't want it. He can't relinquish rights to something he doesn't have rights to. And the commentaries talk about this in the context of something we've seen many times. It's like a davar shelo ba'alo olam. It's as if it's not in existence. Now, of course, it's in existence, right? Davar shelo ba'alo olam. We've had all sorts of like fruits that haven't grown yet, right, or something like that. This is in existence, but it's not in his possession. So it's in the joint possession of all the brothers. You can't be mochel and say I don't want something on something that's not yours yet. So when he said, I don't want the double portion, it only applied to the part that was actually distributed already, because that came into his possession and he said, I don't want it in my possession. And that he gave up. But now the only relevance of this is going to be that when we divide up the property later, if he comes and says, I want a double portion, Rav Papa's going to say he can get it, because even though we thought he relinquished his rights, it wasn't a valid relinquishing of rights because he didn't have rights to it to relinquish. That's Rav Papa. So again, this is all based on, and we're going to go back to this a lot. Ein lo lebechor kodem chaluka. He has no rights to the. Okay, and again, this goes contrary to what we said earlier in the sugya, that we thought he did have rights to it, right? We thought he did own it, and that's why the brothers are gazlanim. But this implies, no, he didn't have rights to it before it was divided. Umada'ata liyade achil, idach lo achil, and only what's in his possession can he be mochel on and say, I don't want this, relinquish his rights. But what didn't come into his possession yet, the other 9 fields or whatever else it might be, he didn't have rights to relinquish. So even though theoretically we assume he meant to relinquish his rights, if he comes later and says, I want pishnayim of this, he gets it. Rav Papi Mishmei de Rava Amar Viter b'chol nechasim kula. Papi says, no way. He relinquishes rights to everything. And now we know what this is going to be based on, what we said earlier, which is Kasavar yesh lo lebachor kodem chalukah. He held that the Pishnayim, not the Yerusha, not the part he gets like all his brothers, but the double portion is a gift. The gift takes effect immediately after the death of the father. So that means that in all of the property, the Bechor has Pishnayim, which means that when he gave up his Pishnayim of one, and we assume it covered everywhere he gave up, he had the right to relinquish his rights because it was his. So therefore, he has no, if he comes later when they distribute the next field and says, I want Pishnayim of this, he can't get it. It's too late. So that's the big machloka between them. And now, right, so he holds the yesh lo lebachor kodem chalukah, and therefore mida acha baha acha bakulu. And since he had mechila and said, I don't want the double portion of this, and we assume he meant, I don't want the double portion of everything, and that's effective because it was his already to relinquish his rights. And now the Gemara says what I told you before, which is Hadran Rav Papi v'Rav Papa lav b'feirishit. They didn't come forward and say, I heard Rava say this, I heard Rava say that. But it was learned out from a situation that happened. So let's learn about the situation. Now it's a totally different situation. It's a situation where a Bechor, a Bechor went, okay, this is a bit of the reverse of the first sugya we learned today, where the brothers went without the Bechor's consent. Here the Bechor went without his brother's consent and sold the entire estate of the father, or a field that was jointly owned, okay, whether it's a field or the whole thing. But he goes and sells, let's just assume he took all of the father's estate and sold it to somebody. Okay, it happened to be fields, there were trees in the fields. Now the orphans who were, now these are different orphans. These are the orphans of his brother, okay? Assuming the case was, there's a Bechor and his brother. There are two of them, but the brother died. And now there's orphans of the brother. So the heirs now are this son, the son of the father who died, who's the Bechor, he's the firstborn. And then there's orphans that are his brother's orphans. Those orphans went and said, well, this is our field, right? Because he didn't have rights to sell our part of the field. So part of the field belongs to us. It's actually a debate. It doesn't really make a difference whether they knew it was sold, or maybe they just went to the field not even knowing it was sold, or either they didn't know it was sold or they knew it was sold, but they figured anyway, a third of it is ours. Because remember, he gets 2/3, they get a third. So they went to eat the fruits in the field. Mehanu lekuchot, from those who now own the field, because they actually bought the whole field. Machunhu, the owners of that field who bought the field from the Bechor, from the firstborn, started hitting these children, these orphans, started beating them. What are you doing eating our fruits? Amru krovim, right? You can imagine the scene. These poor orphans, right? So they can't really fend for themselves. So their relatives, okay, some other relatives, come and start to fight for them. And they go to the buyers and they say, Lomistaya, is it not enough that you bought their property, shelo kedin, right? Not according to the law. And now you're beating them? In other words, is it not enough that you bought their land against the law in a non-lawful manner? Unlawful manner, but now you're actually beating them also. So Atu l'kamei de Rava, the case comes before Rava, and we have the orphans and maybe the relatives fighting for them. We have the buyers, and now we have this deliberation. Who's right? Amar lehu lo asava lo klum, and here's the big lack of there's going to be a big lack of clarity about this statement of Rava, and that's going to leave Rav Papi and Rav Papa to their two different interpretations. Lo asava lo klum. That sale was nothing. The sale that the Bechor did, he had no rights. It was an illegal sale. Now, turning now to Abaye. Mar Savar, okay, Rav Papi, who said, if you remember, the Bechor owned the Pishnayim, remember? Bechor owns the Pishnayim immediately, and therefore can be mochel, can relinquish his rights to the whole thing. So what does that have to do with this? Well, Rav Papi said, when he heard Rava say that, he thought that Rava meant lo asava lo klum bepalga. He didn't do anything on part of the land, meaning the sale was invalid on part of the land. Which part was invalid? Well, number one, he couldn't have sold his brother's part. And number two, he couldn't have sold his part. Which part? His part that was like his brother's part. But the Pishnayim he actually could have sold. Because remember, according to Rav Papi, what did he think? And again, where did he get this from? Well, the way he read Rava was, he couldn't have sold his part of he was able to sell his part of the Pishnayim because that was his already. Because even without distributing the property, that belongs to him only. So that part was valid. What he meant, lo asav lo klum, was on obviously the part of the brothers and his own part. Okay, Tosfot happens to say 2/3 of it actually was sold. All of the parts of the Bechor were sold, just not the part of the other Bechor. He has a whole different interpretation than what I said before. He thinks that because of Dinim of Breira, that you actually are a part owner even of the Yerusha part, and that it's just, it just hasn't been determined yet what belongs to who, but 2/3 from the get-go already belongs to the Bechor. But that's a whole different interpretation. We're sticking with the Rashbam, who we started with. So the Rashbam understands this as the 1/3 that's the portion of the Bechor. That's what Rav Papi understood from this. The 1/3 that was the portion of the Bechorah, that was a valid sale. When Rava said lo asav lo klum, he meant regarding the brother's portion, and also, by the way, the third that was his own portion. Umar savar bekul, and Rav Papa thought though none of it was a valid sale, and that is what led Rav Papa to say that Rava held that even the Bechor part, even the gift part, still is not considered in the Bechor's property until the land is divided. And that's why a Bechor who says, I don't want Pishnayim of this, he has no rights to relinquish his rights at this point to the rest of his Pishnayim because it's not his yet. Okay, and that's where they got their opinions from. We're going to finish up this section with some Piskei Halacha. Who holds by what about does the Bechor have the Pishnayim immediately or not upon the death of the father? Shalchumitam, so they sent from Eretz Israel, right? The same like we had yesterday. Bechor shemachar kodem chaluka lo asav lo klum. A Bechor who sells his property, just like in this case, before it was distributed, lo asav lo klum. None of it was valid. This goes like Rav Papi. Alma ein lo lebechor kodem chaluka. From here you see the Bechor, even the Pishnayim part is not considered in the possession of the Bechor. That's the approach in Israel. But Hilchata comes the Babylonians and they say, well, the halacha is yesh lebechor kodem chaluka. No, the firstborn portion, the double portion, that second portion is actually owned by the Bechor immediately upon death. So we see these two different Piskei Halacha in Israel and in Babylonia. Marzutra, now they give a case where somebody acted upon this. Marzutra midirishba, he was from the city of Rishba. He was a Bechor, a firstborn. Palig bitsana de pilpale bahade achim b'shaveh. This is a kind of funny example. Forget about they divided land. All they divided here was a basket of peppers that were the father's. So they took this basket of peppers and they divided it up, maybe because it was going to rot quickly. So before they got to the land, they said, let's just divide up this basket of peppers, which is a seemingly insignificant item. And he said they did it b'shaveh. He took an equal portion with his brothers for these peppers. Now, again, let's just go. If we hold like the opinion that he was mevater on this and all of the other stuff came into his possession already, yesh l'bechor kodem chaluka, which is what the Babylonians say, then we say, I think I said the opposite before, that Israel held like Rav Papa, not like Rav Papi. And this matches Rav Papi. Sorry if I confused that. The Bechor has rights to all that stuff before the Chalukah, and therefore, if he gives up his rights to part of it, he gave up his rights to everything. And even though this was just peppers that he gave up his rights to, so Ata the Kamei de Rav Ashi, they got before Rav Ashi because Marzutra wanted to get his portion of the rest, his double portion. And the brother said, what do you mean? You gave up on your portion. So it came to the court. Rav Ashi said, Amar leho ilu vitarta b'mitzat, vitarta b'kol nechasim kulam. He says, you gave up your rights to everything, and there's nothing I could do about it. And that's even though, right, it was only something very insignificant, and that's what the Gemara is telling us by this case, still it's considered as if he gave up all of his rights. And what should he have done if he didn't want to? He had to have stated explicitly, I don't want to give up my rights to this. Okay, I'll just tell you, because tell you in a very, very quick, because I want to go back to that Rabbeinu Hanan that I didn't really talk about. Rabbeinu Hanan, I'll understand, now that we know the whole sugya, it'll be a little easier to explain that when Rav Huna said in the name of Rav Asi, B'chor shemicha micha, what they mean is exactly this case. If a Bechor gave up rights to his Bechorah when dividing up a part of the property, but protested and said, but I am not giving up my rights to the rest of the property, as opposed to our case where he didn't say anything, but says, I am not. That's the way Rabbeinu Hanan understands it. That protest is valid. In that case, he gets to keep the double portion of the other stuff. And then you have to just, it's complicated to see how Rabbi Nachman reads the rest of the sugya according to that interpretation. But I will at least give you, as they say in Hebrew, a little tasting of what Rabbi Nachman says. Okay, now we're moving to the next Mishnah. Ha'omer ish ploni, and this really gets to how do we override or circumvent Hilchot Yerusha? This is like the big question. How do we do it nowadays, right? The girls can inherit with boys, or we can decide we're dividing it evenly and there is no pishnaim, and how is that done? So the Mishnah says, this is just laying the groundwork. Ha'omer ish ploni, b'ni b'chor, lo yitol pishnaim. Somebody says, this person, my firstborn son, will not get the pishnaim, or ish ploni b'ni lo yirash mechav, or my son will not get a portion with his brothers. Okay, I want to write this son out of my will. Unfortunately, people do that. Lo amar klum. That is an invalid statement. Sheitna masha katuv b'torah. Okay, there's two problems here. One is he's talking, right, lo yirash. He will not get Yerusha. And Yerusha is something given by Torah law. Okay, or the Bechor gets Pishnayim, and he's saying the Bechor will not get Pishnayim. The other issue is that it's in the negative language. It's saying, I will not give you, as opposed to, we'll see later, you could say, I'm giving this one an equal portion to the Bechor, let's say, or something like that. Wording it in the positive helps, and wording it in the language of a gift helps. Because you can always gift people stuff. You can say, I'm giving a gift. And then you can override laws of inheritance by gifting. So this is basically saying, if you say, I am not doing what it says in the Torah, basically, I am not giving the Bechor Pishnayim, I am not giving my son an equal portion with his other brothers, and, or any portion with his brothers. Obviously, it's not equal because one is a Bechor, but basically meaning, one of those parts. It's an invalid statement because that is a stipulation against what it says in the Torah. And we'll get into the Gemara. They always quote one of the famous cases of this. We'll get back to that soon. But if you are dividing your possessions in words, you're sitting on your deathbed and you start saying, I want to give this portion to this, I want to give this to that, I want to give this to that. If he gave more to one son and less to another son, or he gave the Bechor and divided into 3 equal portions instead of into the Bechor getting half and the others getting the rest. You can do it in this way. But if you said, I'm bequeathing it, and you use the language of inheritance, that's a problem. But if you were writing it down in a will and you wrote somewhere, even if it said the word Yerusha somewhere, but as long as somewhere in that will, whether it's the beginning, the middle, the end, it doesn't really matter. Mishum matana, you use the language of a gift, barav kayami, then it's valid. And we're going to deal a lot more with this as we go on. We're going to see this machlokot, but that's the basic premise of the principles here. Yerusha against what it says in the Torah. Number one, in negative language and using the language of Yerusha is a problem. But if you add, even if you had Yerusha, but you added this to gift, basically by gifting it is a way of overriding it. And by wording it in the positive, seems like you probably need both. Also wording it in the positive and gifting it, then you're allowed to do. To which the Gemara starts off and says, Lema manitin deloka Rabbi Yehuda. It seems like our Mishnah doesn't match Rabbi Yehuda. What does Rabbi Yehuda say? To Rabbi Yehuda, and we've seen his opinion many times, Ha'amar b'davar shamamant ne'okayam. He says you can't go against the Torah if it's isser v'heter, if it's things that are forbidden. Okay? But if it's money, you can go against. The Torah gave guidelines as to how money's supposed to go. But if you want to give up on some money thing, or you want to change some monetary thing, you have the rights to do that. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda, we assume, would say that if he wants to give a different portion, and you could say, I'm not getting the Bechor Pishnayim because it's a monetary issue, and in monetary issues, you can do that. Well, how do we know this? What's Rabbi Yehuda's position? Titania. Ha'omer li sha'arei b'kudeshet li amanat she'en li alai, en lach alai, she'er ksuv ona. I'm betrothing you, but I'm not going to give you the things that a man is obligated to give a wife, which are financial things, okay? Well, most of them. Okay, these are food, shelter, okay, clothing. That he can say, I'm not giving to you. So according to Rabbi Meir, okay, Ona we'll talk about separately for a minute. Ona is sexual relations. That, the rabbis say, of course, he can't give up on that because that's not a monetary issue. However, there are some, the Ritva says, even that he could give up on, because What is monetary? It's monetary versus isser v'heter. And whether he has to provide her with sexual relations is not it's not an isser v'heter issue, so it would fall by default into mamonot. Okay, but most of the commentaries disagree with him and say that's not something he can give up on. But the share and the ksut, okay, so now we have this machloket because we haven't seen Rabbi Yehuda yet. First, we're seeing Rabbi Meir, Divrei Rabbi Meir. She is betrothed, and the condition is canceled. In other words, we just ignore those words that he said because there is no such thing. He went against what it says in the Torah. You can't go against what it says in the Torah. You can't make a stipulation. So we ignore the stipulation, and she's just betrothed, regular woman, betrothal, regular betrothal. He has to commit to her all those things. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, b'davar shamamon now kayam. When it comes to mamonot, and that's where the machloket comes in between the Ritva and others who say whether this includes owner or not, but for sure, the share and the ksut, she's betrothed, and he actually doesn't need to provide her those things. Because first of all, you have to remember in Kiddushin, she agreed to it also, right? It was a, you can go against it as, there's agreement on both sides, it's not a problem. The agreement on both sides is a very important issue because what did the Gemara say? The Gemara said, it seems like our Mishnah doesn't follow Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda says, mamon tno kayam, it's no, right? It works. But now the Gemara says, no, afilu tema Rabbi Yehuda, hatam yada v'kamachla. She knew about it, and when she agreed to get betrothed, because you need her agreement, she agreed to get betrothed. She was willing to give up on those financial commitments. But hachalo kamachlo. But this son didn't say, oh, I'm okay not getting the double portion. So Rabbi Yehuda would say, well, it doesn't work if the Bechor didn't agree. And the Rashbam even goes so far, which is interesting, I think, to say, even if the son was silent, which usually is shtikako da'an, didn't say anything, the father's on his deathbed and said, I'm not giving the Bechor pishnayim. Even then, Rabbi Yehuda wouldn't agree that it works because what's the assumption? He says, his father's on his deathbed. What, he's going to start arguing? No, you couldn't imagine some people doing that. But the fact that he was silent is not an indicator. It's more an indicator that he had respect for his father and didn't argue, but doesn't mean he agreed to it. So therefore, even Rabbi Yehuda would agree with our Mishnah that you can't do that kind of thing. Now we're going to move on to a bit of a different topic. And this is we're going to get to more further on. In fact, Din and Daf this week, which probably will come out on Thursday only, but Din and Daf is going to be on this topic, which is a very interesting topic. It says in the Pasuk about the father, okay, it says, right, remember, he has these two sons, one for the Ahuva, one for the Snua, and then it says, Yakir latet lo pishnayim. He will recognize to give pishnayim. Now, why Yakir? What do you do with that word Yakir? So the drasha on that is, Yakir means Yakirenu la'achirim. The father has the right to recognize this son to others, meaning if he has sons and nobody knows who the Bechor is, okay, they didn't have all these records of birth certificates and all that, and nobody knew who the firstborn was. Now, the assumption here, according to many of the commentaries, is we know he's the son, but we just don't know who the Bechor is. It might be different if we don't even know the person's the son. The father comes along and says, oh, I have a firstborn son somewhere else, and he's really the firstborn. That might be different. But here we're talking about where we know he's the son. The father has the right. We believe a father who says, my son, this one is the firstborn. And you might think, right, maybe not, because maybe he's trying to play with the pishnayim. But he's allowed to do that. So Amar of Yosef. The question is, what wording does he have to use in order for us to be clear that we're talking about that he's the Bechor? Amar ish ploni b'ni b'cholihu notel pishnayim. If he says, this person is my firstborn son, he gets pishnayim. Ish ploni bechorhu, but if you say this person is a bechor, eno notel pishnayim. Even though he probably meant is the bechor in my family, right? Because he's his son. So what does it mean? Well, dilma bechor de ima kama. He might have meant he's the bechor for his mother, but it doesn't mean he's my firstborn. I could have a firstborn with a different wife. So that doesn't help. And in fact, we're going to see two cases now. We'll end with those two cases. Someone came before Rabba Rachana. The father's dead already. And this guy says, I know this is the Bechor. Someone else. Said, how do you know? To have a karele avua buchra because his father would call him foolish firstborn. Okay, so for the fact that the father called him foolish firstborn, I always used to hear him call his son when he was alive, foolish firstborn, or your firstborn fool. Okay, there you see, it's the firstborn. To which Rabbi Chana said, Dilma buchra de'imahu. Maybe he was a Bechor to his mother. And in fact, I think all the more so he is because that is a term people use for Bechor for the mother. Why would you be called a foolish Bechor? Because you're not a real Bechor who has all the rights of a Bechor. You're a Bechor in terms of there's a Pidyon Ben, because you're the first to the mother, first from the womb, but you don't have all the financial rights. So that's why foolish doesn't really mean foolish, like you're not smart. It just means you don't really have good, Bechor rights. So he didn't allow, based on that testimony, for this Bechor to be a Bechor. However, someone came before Rabbi Chanina, Amar le muchzachni b'zeh Bechor. He also said, oh, I know this kid's the Bechor. Amar le menayadat, how do you know? Amar le, they would go to the father. Now you have to know some background here. According to the sugya, people had this eye issue, and they would use the saliva of a firstborn son to cure. It was a known thing, again, hard for us to understand, that the saliva of a firstborn son would be able to cure. So people would come to his father. Amar lehuzilu legabe shichcha, and he would say, go to Shichcha, my son, that was his name. Dibuchrahu umase roke. So he was the Bechor, and you should take his saliva. So they say, but maybe it was for the mother. Maybe he was a firstborn from the mother. To which they say no, because gemire buchur de Abba maseroke, buchur de ima lo maseroke. Okay, for whatever the saliva is worth, right? It's the firstborn from the father who it's known that their saliva works, but not the firstborn from the mother. Very strange. So again, we'll end here. We'll start with the tumtum tomorrow. We're going to get to a tumtum, which is not sure male or female, and then it turns out we find out later he was a male. Does he get pishnayim? And then we'll talk about all sorts of other laws about it, tumtum, shenikra, and other issues. So what did we do today? Again, if we stick with the Rashbam, we had the Bechor shemicha micha, which we understood being that if he didn't want them to invest the money and they did anyway, right, invest the property before dividing. I love we discussed the first part was about this dividing stuff. Then he would be able to get the rights to the enhancements, but not if they changed it entirely, like it already turned into one, because then they acquire it through theft, and then they only have to return it at the value of what it was at the time. We brought Rav Yosef, who seemed to have a different opinion. Then we said, oh, he's talking about the same thing, really, about the kishak zela, because he was talking about a different situation when it went down in value, and then they have to compensate. Then we went to the next law of Rav Asi about a Bechor who took a chelik pashut. He gave up his rights. When they were dividing part of it, the question is, did he give up rights on the whole thing or only gave up rights on that part, but not on the other part because it wasn't his yet? And that gets to this whole debate about, is a Bechor get the pishnayim immediately? Is it already in his possession? Which was really the premise of the first sugya, or not. And that was a machlok of Rav Papa, all about what Rava said when Rava had this situation that came in front of him, which was a different case about a Bechor who sold the portion, right, his portion and his brother's portion and the pishnayim portion to somebody else. Was the sale completely invalid or was it partially valid because the pishnayim part maybe did belong to him? And then we got to this, how do we try to override? Are there ways to be able to override laws of Yerusha? And if so, how? And then we got to this, is the mission not like Rabbi Yehuda? And then we talked about the issue of the father being believed to say, this is my firstborn son. However, it depends how he said firstborn, because it could be there's also a firstborn to the mother. And depending on the language used or what was said or what the situations were, we saw some other situations about whether we would make assumptions that this is a firstborn and we can give him pishnayim, or it would end up being a case where we don't know, and then all the brothers would split everything evenly because if no one can prove that they're Bechor, then we have no way to actually give anyone the double portion. That will finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.